So capitalism, at least in my opinion, doesn't succeed in its promise. It doesn't succeed in what it's supposed to do, which is to maximize human liberty. Instead, it perpetuates human hierarchy, human inequality, to a great extent. From liberalism, we get capitalism, which is now the predominant global economic system. Pay no mind to people who accuse the Scandinavian countries, China, Russia, or whatever else of being socialist countries. They are certainly not. They may have different levels of government involvement, but no, they are all capitalist countries, and they operate based on the same set of rules. But capitalism's continued existence for the past 100 years, or, well, sorry, several hundred years, not just 100, has made some people very mad, very sad, and very mad. And people in their sadness and madness have attempted to address the problems of capitalism with their own solutions in a wide variety of ways. I want to talk about two of those ways: socialism and fascism. Whoop. Or as the cool kids call it, socialism or barbarism. This is a belief held amongst many political radicals. It's a belief that I hold myself to this day, that there are some inconsistencies within capitalism, some internal antagonisms in a dialectical sense, that will lead inevitably to people with different political perspectives sort of grabbing the steering wheel and moving society as they see fit. We have socialists, and socialists' prescriptions for the world are similar to the ones that I've described for you right now. An insistence on systemic problems, that there are systemic solutions to systemic problems, that there is a underlying current of violence behind capitalism and behind the society in which we live. And it can be fixed. It can be fixed if we are diligent and if we distribute public resources well. Now, what this isn't is collectivism. I don't know how this term collectivism hit the public zeitgeist the way that it has, but I want to be perfectly clear, okay? Marx's ideas about society were anything but collectivist. If you want to think about collectivism, okay, if you want to identify collectivism, look at a nationalist. Look at somebody who demands children stand for the flag when the Pledge of Allegiance is sung or spoken at the beginning of every school day. Take a look at many religious groups, especially fundamentalist, orthodox, or evangelical religious groups. These are collectivists. These are people who have a very strong group identity, and their group identity often eclipses their individual identity. The core of socialism is deeply individualist in all of the best ways, an expression of individual rights and a repudiation of an individualist worldview. That is to say, you promote the individual, you champion the rights of the individual, the freedoms of the individual, but you don't delude yourself into believing that all the problems in the world are caused by individuals being lazy workers or individuals being dumb. No. Individual rights, systemic solutions. In my opinion, it's a really good way to look at the world. And then you've got fascism. Oh, whoops. How do we get there? If you've watched my channel for any length of time, you probably know my opinions of fascism. I mean, biases and all that. Not a huge fan myself. Fascists are... Well, it's difficult to describe fascism because fascism is idiosyncratic. That is to say, it pulls from many sources, and it's also deliberately incoherent, in the sense that if you speak to a fascist, or if you ask a fascist what they believe, there's often an undercurrent of anti-intellectualism that will prevent them from being able to give you a complete view of what it is they believe. But I think Umberto Eco's essay on Ur-Fascism, which lists 14 points that describe broadly what fascists tend to be like, is the best description we have presently, in my opinion. If you want a really, really simple explanation, think of it as highly anti-intellectual, ultra-nationalism with a slant towards xenophobia and traditional values. That's kind of the gist of it. Basically, they believe that individual rights, that a promotion of individuality has led to degeneracy, that it's led to individuals being morally repugnant. Usually they think this is, I don't know, interracial marriage or gay people having sex. That tends to be what they cite, you know. as examples of individual degeneracy. And they believe that the solution to this is to double down on a set of very collectivist, very traditionalist hierarchical values that they believe are the core tenets of society: the family, the state, the military, masculinity. Basically, it's very hierarchical and very traditional. And in the interest of fairness, I will say this: what fascists believe at their core is usually motivated by a fear. And that fear of otherness, of alienation, of emasculation, of brown people, of being cucked, whatever, that fear usually stems from some pretty legit problems with how capitalist societies tend to organize themselves. Usually, fascist movements originate from economically um, anxious times where people feel uncertain about the future of their country, and there's a prevailing narrative that somehow the people of your nation are being victimized or played for fools by something, some group, usually a racial, ethnic, or religious group, and that the best way to deal with these anxieties is to repudiate, to reject the atomization, the hyper individualism that that group has pushed upon the people of your country. To double down on love of God, country, state, family, the white race. Many of them believe that too. I don't think this is a great solution to society's problems, which is the reason why fascist governments almost always torpedo themselves and their states into a burning crater. They do a very poor job of meaningfully addressing the problems that they actually intend to solve. And while data on this is shaky, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that fascist governments historically have not really improved the material well-being of the people who live within them. Just generally speaking, feel like on average they're a little bit of a drain on human happiness. Now, I've said a lot more about fascism in the past than this, a lot more, but I'm trying to keep it a little bit simple. Most of the political discourse that you're going to see online is going to be between these three groups, or at least people who associate broadly with these three groups, okay? So when you see America First types talking about globalists and bureaucrats destroying America with immigration, that would be a fascist talking point against capitalist, okay? When you hear people talking about how, border camps are going to be the beginning of the American Fourth Reich and how brown people are soon going to, be led up to camps, you're usually hearing arguments from socialists or from capitalists against fascists. And so on and so on. You've probably heard some iteration of arguments against all of these groups. Capitalists will tend to call socialists financially irresponsible, politically ignorant or naive. They'll usually accuse them of being young or inexperienced, which in many cases they tend to be. Good-hearted, though, mind, at least many of you. And capitalists will usually refer to fascists. Well, it depends. Depending on how much that capitalist would benefit from fascism, the response tends to vary. There were many corporations during Nazi Germany that benefited tremendously from their close association with the Nazi Party. And Hitler himself was very much in favor of the free market. He deregulated many of these businesses and engaged in an act of privatization, that is to say, handing these businesses the keys over to private enterprise. As long as they worked closely with the state, businesses were treated very well under his fascist government. But it wasn't really capitalism because it wasn't really a free market. You had to work in tandem with the state. It was more than capitalism. It was, maybe you could call it, capitalism in decay. What this looks like right here, what I'm doing right here, it looks like I'm trying to set up a political compass. You've all seen this, I assume? Or maybe subreddits built around this. We've all seen something to this effect. Well, chat's not working right now, but I imagine you have. This is called a political compass. A political compass is a way of, how would you describe it, of mathematically, of geographically triangulating a set of political positions, What are you? Oh, I'm auth-right. I'm lib-left. I'm auth-left. I'm lib-right. And while there is some descriptive utility to these positions, in reality, I think that the idea of a political compass encourages a lot of laziness. It's actually it's not just reductive, it's flat out inaccurate. It just doesn't make sense if you actually think about it for a little while. Um, for example, you talk about like lib left and lib right unity, or off left and off right unity, or lib left off left, or lib right and auth right. And it feels like what's really happening there when you talk about stuff like this is you're memifying political discourse. You're simplifying very complicated political positions down to a set of identifiers or basic characteristics, and then you're extrapolating from them the graph around which they're built. That is to say, the political positions arrived before the graphs used to describe them. The main reason that they don't work, I think, is because there are actually three principal axes along which you should be describing political positions. So here's a question for you guys, okay? The top down means auth, right? Auth, left, lib, left, auth, right, lib, right. So it refers to state control, I assume, where up here you would have a dictator and down here you would have an anarchist, I imagine. Okay. And then left and right refer to how much your market is, free as opposed to controlled. So the ultra libertarians would be over here, like capitalists, and then over here you would have socialists. So if that's the case, where does political liberalization versus political radicalization happen? If the people up here are dictators, the people down here anarchists, the people over here socialists, and the people over here capitalists, where does hating black people fit on this scale? Does that make you more of a dictator? Well, no. I mean, memes aside, there are plenty of people in this circle right here seem to hate black people. Where does that fit exactly? Where does political or social liberalism fit in versus reactionary positions? It actually doesn't fit in this chart if you think about it. You can try to squeeze it in, but it doesn't work. This chart doesn't work. I mean, there are a lot of libertarian right people who, if you actually press them just a little bit, are like auth right. Ben Shapiro is an example. Ben Shapiro claims to be a libertarian conservative, but he wants to ban pornography, promote like religious rights and like religious or like a religious hierarchy in society, and he's deeply in support of like authoritarian conservative control of the state. So is he a libertarian? Well, no. Well, I've met actual conservative libertarians, but they also tend to be in favor of a lot of the stuff that authoritarian conservatives engage in with regards to like welfare programs, which leads to a reduction of human equality in a way that is what exactly? I don't think that these labels work. And I think the more you think about them, the less they actually work. Another good example of this would be authoritarian leftists, like the people who tend to defend China. Now, this is a contentious position of mine, but I do sincerely believe this. I believe that many of the people who are super out to defend Russia or the USSR or China act indistinguishably from a lot of fascists, because they seem to enjoy more than anything else the military propaganda, the state power, the aesthetic of the Soviet Union, strong-shouldered men with chiseled jaws staring forward as they gather grain from the collective or whatever. But these aesthetics are not egalitarian or socialist in nature. If anything, they're the opposite. The idea of sterling military authority figures represented by 6'2" white guys with square jaws collecting resources from what are essentially like modern peasantry, that doesn't really gel with my understanding of socialism. If anything, it seems like a promotion of class collaborationism, which is a fascist idea. That is to say, the party leaders who rule over society are actually super duper just one of you common workers, fellow USSR comrades. Thank you very much. We're actually just one and the same. Hey, don't worry about it. So are they fascists? Well, no, fascists hate the USSR. So what gives? I don't think that you can get any real descriptive value from these ideas, okay? I think there's actually just one real political compass, okay? It's super reductive, but it's also, in my opinion, the one that really matters, okay? And that political compass is a line, and it's hierarchy versus equality. I have found in my talking with people and arguing my positions and believing the things that I believe that the most consistent, the most explanatory, the most descriptive way of describing people's political positions is whether they hinder or help human equality, human freedom, whether they liberate humans or restrict them. This falls in line with a very fundamental reactionary versus politically liberal tenet. The idea that human beings should rule over others or should not. There are many people, fascists are the extreme example of this, but many others do believe this as well. They believe that humans are naturally either politically worthy of power or not, and that societies function best when humanity is organized like a sharp pyramid, where you have people on top and people in the middle and the people on the bottom, and then there are people who believe that society would be better if the pyramid was as flat as possible. If the common people, the people on the bottom, really weren't that far away from the points of power at the top. If you'll recall, the Enlightenment was all about flattening that pyramid. I mean, this was a monarchy, baby. How do you get more hierarchical than that? You got divine blood or you don't. Or actually, it's like this, and like the monarchy is up here, and then you have the aristocracy, and then you have the peasantry, Like, yikes. But democracies don't really function like that. Leadership in democracy, I mean, technically they serve us. That's what they're supposed to do. That's their role. So they're up here, sure, but they're meant to be accountable. They're closer to us. In my mind, capitalism is inequitable in large part because the way our economy works gives an ungodly number of resources to a very small number of people on the top, and we can't even touch them. The amount of wealth inequality in America today is greater than it ever has been, and it's like near the pharaoh levels. I mean, you can imagine the Egyptian pharaohs sitting upon their crowns of their thrones of gold or whatever, and then you have all the slaves and peasants outside, and that's where we're at, basically, when it comes to wealth distribution, more so than anything else. I've talked a lot about this, and this may all seem very esoteric, but these are the fundamental beliefs that I use to organize my thought process when I'm thinking politically. When I think about ideas or values, when I think about whether or not I like a thing, whether or not I like a position, whether or not I'm fond of X or Y, I always try to think of it in relation to how does this discourse contribute to the fundamental war between equality and inequality, between hierarchy and liberation. How do these relate? What's the relationship between these factors? Everything that I think of, all the political beliefs that I hold, all the policy discussions I engage in, they all come from that first and foremost. That's the bedrock of my political thinking. That's what I get it all from, Go look at what's cited in a political article. You can get a lot out of that. You can get an unbelievable amount out of that. It's so beneficial. If there's anything that I would actually consider to be more important than your research method, it would be something called the sociological imagination. I would ask my chat if they know what that is, if they were here to be with me. The sociological imagination was the first thing that I was taught when I got my sociology, undergrad started. And what it taught me was that it's important to stay hydrated. It also taught me to be critical and to be curious when imagining why the world is the way it is. See, a lot of people tend to believe that the world is the way it is in some essentialist way. Why are poor people poor? Well, this is a contentious one, isn't it? Why are black people in America poorer than white people? Why do women and men tend to act differently? Why is this part of the world full of violence and this part of the world stable and secure? And often people resort to very lazy answers to those questions. In truth, there's only one answer, an answer with a million possible explanations. And that answer is that a combination of political, social, economic, religious, whatever factors led to things being the way they are. There are very few essentialist explanations in human society. This is, after all, a society. It's one that we built. It's one that we live in. We did find it in the desert. We constructed it. We built this world. There's nothing essential to it, or at least there's very little essential to it. We made this world. And because we've been around for a long time, and because developed societies have been around for a long time, there have been plenty of opportunities for people with different values, people with different political beliefs, people with different levels of power to interact with each other in ways that have disadvantaged some groups and advantaged others. Have a sociological imagination. Don't be lazy. Don't just think, oh, this thing is the way it is because it is. It's not helpful. It won't help you understand these problems. I can't tell you how many arguments I've had with usually conservatives about, this is again a contentious one, but it's one that comes up often in my line of work, about racial income gaps. You know, why do black people have so much less money? Well, slavery was like 150 years ago, and, you know, the Civil Rights Act passed 60 or so years ago, so why? You know, that's what they ask me, and it's always tough talking with them, in part because I don't think they realize how short a time 60 years is to have been a second-class citizen, but also because it feels like they're not actually asking. What they're trying to do is shift blame. There's the perception on the part of a lot of conservatives that attempts to address systemic racism are actually an attempt to fleece white people or to make them feel guilty. That left-leaning people, like me, are trying to make white people guilty. We're trying to impugn them for the sins that white people have committed in the past. Nothing is less interesting to me than that. Nothing. It's incredibly uninteresting to me. What I'm actually interested in, more than anything else, is setting up the cards, putting the pieces together in such a way as to ensure that we don't have these problems anymore. But you can't do that until you know where those pieces are, how they're arranged. And in order to know that, you need to have the imagination to think, why is there a racial income gap? What did lead to that? Was it redlining? Well, that's part of it. Was it policing? Well, that's part of it. Was it legislation? Well, that's part of it. Just think about it for a bit.